Good morning. We're back again reading about 10 minutes a day from the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice. And we are reading from John Hasnas, The Myth of the Rule of Law, 1995, in chapter 21. And again, it's 8/18/21, and we're in episode 83. We're starting on page 337, getting toward the end of the book. So here we go at the top of 337. To Socrates' protest that people didn't seem to be exploited in other clothing markets, and that the shoes manufactured under the present system didn't really fit very well anyway, the party leader responded, quote, "The shoe market is unique. Adequate shoes are absolutely essential to public welfare. Therefore, the ordinary laws of supply and demand cannot be relied upon. And even if we could somehow get around the practical problems, your idea is simply not politically feasible. To make any progress, we must focus on what can actually be accomplished in the current political climate. If we begin advocating radical constitutional changes, we'll be routed in the next election." End quote. Disillusioned by this response, Socrates approached the conservative Republicans with his idea, explaining that if shoes could be manufactured in any size, all children could be provided with the well-fitting shoes they needed. However, the conservative Republicans were even less receptive than the liberal Democrats had been. The leader of their local party responded quite contemptuously, saying, quote, "Look, Monocysia is the greatest, freest country on the face of the planet, and it's respect for our traditional values that has made it that way. Our Constitution is based on these values, and it has served us well for the past 200 years. Who are you to question the wisdom of the Founding Fathers? If you don't like it in this country, why don't you just leave?" End quote. Somewhat taken aback, Socrates explained that he respected the Monocysian constitution as much as they did, but that did not mean it could not be improved. Even the Founding Fathers included a process by which it could be amended. However, this did nothing to ameliorate the party leader's disdain. He responded, quote, "It's one thing to propose amending the Constitution. It's another to undermine it entirely. Doing away with the shoe size provision would rend the very fabric of society. If people could make whatever size shoes they wanted, whenever they wanted, there would be no way to maintain order in the industry. What you're proposing is not liberty, it's license. Were we to adopt your proposal, we would be abandoning the rule of law itself. Can you see what you are advocating is not freedom but anarchy?" End quote. After this experience, Socrates came to realize that there was no place for him in the political realm. As a result, he went off to college, where he took up the study of philosophy. Eventually, he got a PhD, became a philosophy professor, and was never heard from again. So what is the point of this outlandish parable? I stated at the beginning of this section that as long as the law remains a state monopoly, there will always be a political struggle for its control. This sounds like a cynical conclusion because we naturally assume that the law is necessarily the province of the state. Just as the Monocysians could not conceive of a world in which shoe size was not set by the government, we cannot conceive of one in which law is not provided exclusively by it. But what if we are wrong? What if, just as Monocysia could eliminate the politics of shoe size by allowing individuals to produce and buy whatever size shoes they pleased, we could eliminate the politics of law by allowing individuals to adopt whatever rules of behavior best fit their needs? What if law is not a unique product that must be supplied on a one-size-fits-all basis by the state, but one which could be adequately supplied by the ordinary play of market forces? What if we were to try Socrates' solution and end the monopoly of law? Section 12. The problem with this suggestion is that most people are unable to understand what it could possibly mean. This is chiefly because the language necessary to express the idea clearly does not really exist. Most people have been raised to identify law with the state. They cannot even conceive of the idea of legal services apart from the government. The very notion of a free market in legal services conjures up the image of anarchic gang warfare or rule organized by crime, or rule by organized crime. In our system, an advocate of free market law is treated the same way Socrates was treated in Monocysia, and is confronted with the same type of arguments. The primary reason for this is that the public has been politically indoctrinated to fail to recognize the distinction between order and law. Order is what people need if they are to live together in peace and security. Law, on the other hand, is a particular method of producing order. As it is presently constituted, law is the production of order by requiring all members of society to live under the same set of state-generated rules. It is the order produced by centralized planning. Yet from childhood, citizens are taught to invariably link the words law and order. Political discourse conditions them to hear and use the terms as though they were synonymous and to express the desire for a safer, more peaceful society as a desire for, quote, law and order. The state nurtures this confusion because it is the public's inability to distinguish order from law that generates its fundamental support for the state. As long as the public identifies order with law, it will believe that an orderly society is impossible without the law the state provides. And as long as the public believes this, it will continue to support the state almost without regard to how oppressive it may become. The public's identification of order with law makes it impossible for the public to ask for one without asking for the other. There is clearly a public demand for an orderly society. One of human beings' most fundamental desires is for a peaceful existence secure from violence. But because the public has been conditioned to express its desire for order as one for law, all calls for a more orderly society are interpreted as calls for more law. And since under our current political system, all law is supplied by the state, all such calls are interpreted as calls for a more active and powerful state. The identification of order with law eliminates from public consciousness the very concept of the decentralized provision of order. With regard to legal services, it renders the classical liberal idea of a market-generated, spontaneous order incomprehensible. I began this article with a reference to Orwell's concept of doublethink. But I am now describing the most effective contemporary example we have of Orwellian, quote, newspeak, the process by which words are redefined to render certain thoughts unthinkable. Were the distraction between order and law well understood, the question of whether a state monopoly of law is the best way to ensure an orderly society could be intelligently discussed. But this is precisely the question that the state does not wish to see raised. By collapsing the concept of order into that of law, the state can ensure that it is not, for it will have effectively eliminated the idea of a non-state generated order from the public mind. Under such circumstances, we can hardly be surprised if the advocates of a free market in law are treated like Socrates of Monocysia. Section 13. I am aware that this explanation probably appears as initially unconvincing, as was my earlier contention that the law is inherently political. Even if you found my Monocysia parable entertaining, it is likely that you regard it as irrelevant. You probably believe that the analogy fails because shoes are qualitatively different from legal services. After all, law is a public good which, unlike shoes, really is crucial to public welfare. It is easy to see how the free market can adequately supply the public with shoes, but how can it possibly provide the order-generating and maintaining process necessary for the peaceful coexistence of human beings in society? What would a free market in legal services be like? I am always tempted to give the honest and accurate response to this challenge, which is that to ask the question is to miss the point. If human beings had the wisdom and knowledge-generating capacity to be able to describe how a free market would work, that would be the strongest possible argument for central planning. One advocates a free market not because of some moral imprimatur written across the heavens, but because it is impossible for human beings to amass the knowledge of local conditions and the predictive capacity necessary to effectively organize economic relationships among millions of individuals. It is possible to describe what a free market in shoes would be like because we have one. But such a description is merely an observation of the current state of a functioning market, not a projection of how human beings would organize themselves to supply a currently non-marketed good. To demand that an advocate of free market law, or Socrates of Monocysia for that matter, describe in advance how markets would supply legal services, or shoes, is to issue an impossible challenge. Further, for an advocate of free market law, or Socrates, to even accept this challenge would be to engage in self-defeating activity, since the more successfully he or she could describe how the law, or shoe market would function, the more he or she would prove that it could be run by state planners. Free markets supply human wants better than state monopolies precisely because they allow an unlimited number of suppliers to attempt to do so. By patronizing those who most effectively meet their particular needs and causing those who do not to fail, consumers determine the optimal method of supply. If it were possible to specify in advance what the outcome of this process of selection would be, there would be no need for the process itself. Although I am tempted to give this response, I never do. This is because, although true, it never persuades. Instead, it is usually interpreted as an appeal for blind faith in the free market, and the failure to provide a specific explanation as to how such a market would provide legal services is interpreted as proof that it cannot. Therefore, despite the self-defeating nature of the attempt, I usually do try to suggest how a free market in law might work. And we will leave it at that tantalizing point for today at the top of page 341 of the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice. And we'll be back mañana.